Okay. So I've tried to divide this into different sections, and it's always difficult to fit something into half an hour because there's so much to talk about. But I'm going to talk about health issues if nothing goes wrong, right in the normal operation of a nuclear power station. Let's have a look at that. Later we'll talk about the small risk of something going badly wrong, but this is the normal operation. It took me a long time to get this report, and it was part of an EIR process, environmental impact report, process that I managed to get it. It's 6 boreholes that were dug around Koeberg or drilled around Koeberg, and they measure the levels of radiation in the groundwater. And you'll notice that the norm is less than 3. It's a bit generous. You can see normally it's right down there. But occasionally you get these spikes of tritium, which is a radioactive form of hydrogen. And it goes up to 8, which is quite a bit higher. And I read the text underneath, and this is from a report, and please, I'll say this once, but it applies to everything I've got here. If you want a reference, if you want to see the original copies, if you're skeptical, I admire that. Please be skeptical, because there's a lot of nonsense out there. So ask me, and I'll give you the copies of these reports or where you can find them on the ESCOM site. So they explain this by saying, yeah, it's normally less than 3, but there have been elevated levels of 4.8, 5.5, and once 42. So that's quite a bit higher than the normal less than 3. But they reassure us by saying, don't worry, these are the result of known releases of tritiated condensate and steam. So it means that in the normal operation procedure, they know there's a pathway where they release tritiated steam into the environment, it goes into the groundwater, and that's demonstrated there. So a lot of people find that quite a surprise. They say, surely they don't let radiation out. Isn't it completely safe? It's clean, safe, and efficient. I've read that in the paper somewhere. So this is meant to break that belief. There is radiation released in the normal operation of a nuclear power plant. What is tritium? Just a little bit of background. It's linked to cancer, obviously, as anything radioactive is. And if you have any significant amount that you ingest, particularly ingestion is the dangerous thing about radiation, because then it's direct access to the body without the protection of the skin and so on. And it's linked to cancer. It has a half-life of 12 years, which means after 12 years it's half as dangerous as it was. After 24 years, quarter of as dangerous as it was, and so forth, right? If you swallow it, it's called a biological half-life, is about 7 days, because in that time, about half of it has been excreted from the body. But if you're drinking it because you're using a borehole that's got radioactive water, obviously that keeps being replenished. So that is a bit of a concern when it comes to health. However, now that's the next slide. Keep the however for just now. This is something called the National Radioactive Waste Management Policy and Strategy. And I noticed something interesting, because I've ended up reading a lot of ESCOM documents. The interesting thing it says here, the scope of this policy relates to all radioactive wastes except operational radioactive liquid and gas. So, in other words, as long as it's part of the normal operation, then it's not subject to the policy of waste management, which is completely contradictory to the city of Cape Town. That's where I'm from. Sorry to give that quote, but a waste is normally any superfluous byproduct emission or residue, but not to the nuclear industry. It excludes the normal operation emissions. But we know we've got lots of bodies that look after us. This is where the however comes in, like the World Health Organization. You familiar with that body? And its job is to do what? Anyone? What's that? Regulate health issues. So its priority, you'd think, would be to look after the health of the public. Okay. So I also believe that, but I was a little bit concerned. I'm going to come back to that other slide. I was a little bit concerned when I came across this. And it's an agreement between the World Health Organization and the International Atomic Energy Association. Now, the job of the International Atomic Energy Association is to promote nuclear energy, right? It's an industry association. So if you read this report, this agreement, which is quite old, it says any time there's something that affects both parties, they'll get together and discuss it with a view to adjusting the matter. I'm not quite sure what adjusting the matter is. I would have loved to see protecting the public health there, or ensuring the truth came out. If you read on a bit, it says, we'll make sure that we'll consult with each other to make the most efficient use of information. Sounds a little Orwellian to me, and I think that's a concern. So it's quite a worry if you read a report by the World Health Organization. For example, there's one that says 4,000 people have died of cancer from the Chernobyl incident. You kind of wonder, is that an accurate and fair reflection, or have they consulted with the IAEA and adjusted the matter for the efficient use of information? Now, when you have very low levels of radiation that's in the environment, often those levels are very low. And there's some contention in the scientific literature. Does a low dose cause a low incidence of cancer? It's not certain. But what can happen is a process something like this. Iodine in this example. I don't know if you saw the press. About 3 weeks ago, there was a whole cloud of iodine detected over Austria. Don't know if anyone saw that in the press. They didn't know where. See some nodding heads. They don't know where it comes from. Might have been Fukushima, might not. It's a bit of a mystery. Anyway, this is iodine, and it can get blown in the wind after it's released. It can then cause, after some rain, it can land on the ground. You get little rivulets forming. It goes into sub-valleys and then into the valleys, and that might be a pasture at the bottom. Might be cows grazing there, and the cows collect various things from the grass, accumulate that, and manufacture milk. That milk is then drunk, often by children, and iodine concentrates in the body, in the human body, in the thyroid gland, because that's the only place we use iodine. And that causes what's called a point source of radiation. So although it was very, very dilute in the environment, it ends up being a point source. And thyroid cancer was the most common illness after Chernobyl because of this pathway. So the message to take away from this is, although it's a low level, that doesn't mean it's a low effect at the end of the day. Last comment on this. France is often held up. You might know Riva is the French nuclear company, and they are punting very heavily to be the next supplier of nuclear energy. These are 4 things. You can check them in the mainstream press. They were very widely reported. 74 kilograms of uranium leaked, 30 cubic meters of liquid leaked, some pipe, they found a hole and been seeping out for years. So this is the country that is the leader, the world leader in nuclear energy. So I put this slide up to show that these aren't unique and unusual things that happen. What's this? Over 3 years, 4 incidents. Okay. So it's not pleasant to dwell on negative things. But it is something that we need to think about, particularly when there's something as powerful as nuclear power. So what happens if things all go wrong? This is 2006, I think. Melanie Gosling, a well-known environmental writer, and she was talking about the list of things that have gone wrong and the report that was brought out by NERSA, which is the National Energy Regulator of South Africa. And you might see there's a word in common every time there was a cause found. They found there were inadequate procedures, inadequate training. And I think in my mind it went through, what went through my mind after Japan was the fact that the Japanese have quite a culture of exactitude and high levels of technical skill. And that's maybe an additional concern when it comes to installing lots of nuclear power stations in South Africa. Now, it's always interesting to see someone's response when you put something to them, when you put a complaint to them, whatever, and you see how they respond to that. So here's the spokesperson of Koeberg responding. You might remember, do you remember this? About 90 workers got irradiated with cobalt. Her response, well, it's not uncommon for this to happen. Come on, get over it. Then there was another case. There was a small leaking fuel rod, and that fuel rod is uranium pellets encased in, I think, zirconium, and there was a small fault which caused a pinprick leak through the zirconium cladding. And what that means is some radiation seeped out into the primary cooling circuit of the reactor, and I'll show you what that means in a moment. But here's the response from the PR person. It's not the first time this has happened, and it probably won't be the last. And there they say themselves, in quote marks, there's a small pinprick hole in the rod and the fuel has direct access to the water that surrounds it. That makes sense. So again, I'm making sure that when I quote stuff, I'm quoting Eskom here, right? That's Eskom's spokesperson. So let's have a look at the consequences of that. This is a very simplified diagram of a nuclear reactor, pressurized water reactor, and these are the fuel rods, these long vertical things over there. I've just colored this water red. It's not really red, it's just water. And when there's a pinprick hole in one of these fuel rods, can you see that this is the water called the primary loop that becomes radioactive? That makes sense? Okay, no rocket science there. Now, this is the rest of the nuclear reactor, such as Koeberg. And what happens here is that if while this normal reaction, this normal situation that happens all the time, right, that causes this to be radioactive water, if while that is happening, we get a hole developing in this pipe, can you see that the green circuit would become radioactive as well? That makes sense? And that is the containment wall. And it's often said that nuclear power is so safe because the containment wall keeps all the radiation in. But here with one hole and a normal situation, we get radiation seeping out of the, not seeping, but being flowing out of the containment wall. Now, you know from driving that when something goes wrong, normally it's okay. You accidentally swerve across the road because you're talking on your cell phone. Other people do that, not me, of course. And nothing goes wrong because the lane is empty. But it's when two things go wrong that there's a problem, right? That's when we have an accident. And in this scenario, if we ever had this normal situation of radioactive red water and a hole developing there, and while it's still there, a hole develops there, can you see that it's straight into the seawater? So this isn't an obscure, ridiculous sequence of events that goes on. This is something that's not that hard to imagine. Also, Koeberg is what, 20 years old now, 30 years old, 1986, whatever that comes to. So you can imagine after all that time, with hot water being pumped around and around, that the chances of corrosion are not that obscure. So this is a concern. This is a real danger. That's Fukushima. And we were told this wasn't a nuclear explosion. This was just the heat of the runaway reaction that caused water to boil and hydrogen to be formed and some kind of hydrogen explosion. And this was the result of it. Now, when I first looked at this photo, I thought these were air conditioning ducts. You know what I'm talking about? Those big sort of soft ducts. But if you go in a little bit closer, then you see what that actually is. That's concrete with a reinforcing bar in it. So all of those were blown clean off the building. And that's the force of this thing when it doesn't run out of control. That was just the heating that caused the steam to explode. I think of this stuff as a sleeping dragon, and you've got to keep tickling the dragon just right, and it produces power. But if the dragon ever wakes up or something goes wrong, it goes very, very, very wrong. Anybody know what that is? Or what that was, I should say. That hole was the reactor at Chernobyl. That's resulted in a 50-kilometer radius being uninhabitable. This is a map of Chernobyl, and it's from the United Nations. Again, there's my source, Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation. And Chernobyl sits there. I don't know if you can see it clearly. And this is Chernihiv, and I happen to know that Chernihiv is 80 kilometers away from Chernobyl, and Kiev is 100 kilometers away. So does that give you an idea of scale? Okay. You can see this area here is about, background radiation is normally around 1 becquerel per square meter. Here they ignore anything less than 37 becquerels per square meter. So this is about 3,000 times higher than the normal. So that is the fallout. This is cesium, only one particular radioactive element. And you can see that that's how it's spread. And it's not in a perfect circle and it's not in a perfect plume because weather's not like that. You might notice if there's a fire somewhere far away, even if the wind's not directly at you, you still smell the smoke because the wind moves around in complicated ways, and then there's rainfall, and that might cause it to fall over there and fall over there. So strangely enough, Chernihiv was completely spared, but areas much further away were contaminated and uninhabitable. They built a hospital in Chernihiv, by the way, specifically to diagnose the Chernobyl victims. 50 doctors, each seeing 20 patients a day. That hospital ran for, I don't know, at least 5 years, because I know someone who worked there, but probably longer. About half of them were diagnosed with radiation illnesses. So let's have a look at Cape Town. And I know perhaps your focus is Bantam's clip, but my focus is Koeberg. So this, whoops, wrong button. Nothing can go wrong, that's Koeberg over there. That little spot there, and this is a 20-kilometer circle around it. So this is the area that was mandatory evacuation. The police in Japan, after Fukushima, knocked on your door and said, you move out of your house, and you probably never go back there for your lifetime. While we're on that subject, let me take an aside. How common is the knowledge that your insurance policy doesn't cover loss of value due to radiation damage? Who knows that? 1, 2... Well, not common, huh? So go read your homeowner policy or your property, whatever it is, policy. You'll find there's a clause in there that says the value of your property, if it drops due to any radiation illness, radiation contamination, is not covered by this policy. If you have a mortgage on your property, however, the bank isn't interested in your problem. So you're still required to pay your mortgage. And if you can't, you'll be, other assets will be forfeit, or perhaps you'll be sequestrated if necessary. But your property, you can imagine putting it on the market after some kind of leak, you're not going to find many buyers. That larger circle is the Chernobyl thing. So basically, if this thing went like Chernobyl went, we would find that Cape Town is really uninhabitable. I know you guys spend a lot, or a lot of your focus is tourism around here. My sister lives in Canada, and I asked her the question, if something happened at Koeberg, like you read in the paper, there was a leak of some kind, not a big explosion, because we're not, this thing about a mushroom cloud, and that's an atomic bomb. We're not talking about that. We're talking about a leak of some kind. It's in the press. Radiation is found around Koeberg. I asked my sister, because my parents still live here, how many years would it be before you would be prepared to bring your children back here to visit? And she looked at me like I was crazy, and she said, never. Never. I would never bring my children to a town when there's been a radiation leak. So that was, to me, an indication of what's going to happen to the tourism industry. And it doesn't matter if it's Cape Town, if it's Bantamsklip, if it's Tastepunt. People aren't that differentiated. You might know that when Zimbabwe had problems, because in Southern Africa, all the investors took their money out of South Africa, because people don't really have that kind of differentiation. So rest assured, the tourism industry would suffer wherever such an incident occurred. Have you seen the specials on Japanese mushrooms in Woolworths recently? Would you buy mushrooms from Japan at the moment? No? Yes? I didn't say mushrooms from Fukushima. I said mushrooms from Japan. But all of you are shaking your head. So do you think people in the EU are going to buy agricultural products from South Africa if there's a leak anywhere along this? It's going to be the same reaction. Basically, the entire export market of all agricultural products are at risk. All right, that was a little aside. Back to where we were. I'm trying to give you an idea of scale as well, and this will highlight what I'm saying about is it a problem for different people. Look closely. That's the scale. I made those two maps to the same scale. Right? You see that? That gives you an idea that if we have a Chernobyl-type incident, the area that's going to be covered. It's nonsense to say I live 100 k's away, I live 200 k's away, there's no problem. There are a lot of accidents as well. This is a list, a database that IAEA maintained. They stopped in 1999 for some reason. And these are the major accidents that have happened throughout the world. These things do happen. We've all heard of Fukushima, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, but there's a long list of things that have happened, a lot of them in the USSR, former USSR. So now you might have seen this outside. By law, we have a body called the National Nuclear Regulator that is obliged to have a plan or ensure that a plan is in place. So if something goes badly wrong, they must be able to get people out and do whatever they need to do. So I thought it would be interesting to see that plan. So I wrote to Eskom, eventually through a lawyer because they were ignoring me, and we did what's called a Promotion of Access to Information request, which is an act. The legal beagles amongst you will know what I'm talking about. And they answered me. They're not going to provide a copy of the emergency and evacuation plan. It's none of the business of the public, apparently. And this was the reason they gave. Now, no one can make any sense of this, so I'm not going to ask you to make any sense of it. Had some of the finest lawyers around, it just doesn't make any sense. We couldn't practice this plan. You wanted me to read it? The decision we have taken is not to provide a copy of the emergency and evacuation plan. It's my Eskom voice. The information is protected under section yada yada, operations of public bodies, as we believe that its disclosure could reasonably be expected to jeopardize the effectiveness of a testing procedure used by a public body. So we've done another PIA now, and they are obliged to respond this week. That's when the 30-day period runs out. And what the lawyers said to me, if there's no media attention on this, they can write any garbage they like because there's nothing really, so what, who's watching? So it's really necessary for this to be done under the public scrutiny. So if you can do anything, call your radio station, try and get some media attention on this, I think it might mean they're going to think more carefully before they write a response like this to us next time. And of course, if they do this again, we're going to appeal because it's just ridiculous after Fukushima. We believe that they say a 16-kilometer zone is all they have to worry about. And we know that Fukushima, it's 20 kilometers a zone. So once that report is released, we might find some interesting comments on it. And I've got a feeling maybe that's not going to be very welcome, which could be why they're refusing to release it. Not going to go into this detail. I think some of you already mentioned this. There's a fault line, which is called the Milnerton fault line. Those of you who know a bit of geology will know that the, the Rift Valley, the seismic activity of the Rift Valley is moving southwest across the country. So you don't have to know too much geography to figure out where that's going to come. So it's likely to happen again. We had a huge earthquake in 1811 around South Africa, around Cape Town. They guessed about 6.5 on the Richter scale. And these things are periodic. So every now and again it happens. And you know it's plates moving, and as they move, every now and again they jerk. So it's something that's going to happen. It's not really a question of if it'll happen. It's just how long is it going to be before it actually happens again. 200 years, another 200 years, 100 years, 50 years, next year. It's a statistical thing. We don't know. Okay. Some light relief after all of that. Are there any architects in the house? Architects? Right, you're not allowed to answer this, okay? I'm going to show you a plan, and you've got 10 seconds to tell me what's missing from the plan. Ready? Go. Human mind's very good. It's interesting. We pattern recognizers, so we see what's there very clearly. But it's very hard for us to think of what's not there, unless you're an architect, and then I'm sure you spotted that, sir. So in this family room, which I modified shamelessly on Photoshop, in this family home, there's no toilet. Now, why do I put this up, do you think? You get the link? This is the nuclear industry. What they're doing is they're building an industry that generates a lot of waste. Every nuclear plant about 30 tons per year of high-level waste, and they have no idea what to do with it. And to me, that borders on criminal. And I think my position anyway is that before they go any further in even thinking about building another nuclear reactor, the first thing they should do is build a toilet for it, or at least decide what are we going to do with this thing. But no, they're not doing it. The nuclear waste was planned to stay at Koeberg for 4 or 5 years. Different figures in the NNR report and ESCOM's report, either 4 or 5. But now it's been what they call ultra-high level density racking, which means they're taking that spent fuel and putting it into water ponds in an ultra-high density way. So what was designed for 5 years is now going to be used for 40 years, unless maybe they increase it. There are some ideas what to do with it. You can put it in a spacecraft, shoot it up into space, hope the spacecraft doesn't explode on the way. It'll be unfortunate, might contaminate a continent or two. You could store it. You can build a big fence and leave it there for 100,000 years, and then it won't be that dangerous after that. Also quite tricky to think of how to build a fence. You can chuck it into the sea, because, who knows what happens down there anyway. They were doing that up to 1993, would you believe it? Deep geological storage, I also call this the suppository method. They find a big hole and they put the waste deep inside the hole and hope it never comes out again. In the United States, and there's a slide out there, they've spent about $90 billion trying to do this. Since 1957, they started the process, and they haven't yet found a solution. They've just cancelled Yucca Mountain, so they don't know what to do with it, despite all that time and all that money. But South Africa is thinking of another 6 nuclear reactors. This is one way of dealing with waste. This is in the Northern Cape. This community doesn't have ESCOM electricity, by the way, just as a little ironic twist to the whole thing, but they do get all the waste from Koeberg, the low-level waste. Just to clarify, I was talking about high-level waste before, which is the 30 tons a year. About 1,000 tons of it are sitting at Koeberg. Very, very dangerous stuff. That's what caused Fukushima to explode, they think. This is the low-level waste, which is gloves and overalls and stuff, and they put it in barrels and they dig a hole and they drop it in there. That's the slide. I don't want to go into much detail, but that's the history. You can see it outside of starting from 1957. Little twist here as well. The current waste is about 75 kilotons in the US, and in fact, even if they'd finished Yucca Mountain, which they haven't, it wouldn't all fit in there. So it gives you an idea of the sort of scope of the problem. Lawyers amongst you might be interested in this. The utilities are going to sue the federal government for failing to provide this waste storage facility, and they reckon the lawsuits will be about $15 billion. Note that means nothing's solved, that's just the lawsuits. You still got to then build the thing afterwards. This is the one, and it's very dense, and I apologize, but I really, this is something that's worried me the most recently. if you put these fuel rods, which still get very hot, not hot enough to boil water quickly enough to be useful, but they still get very hot and slowly boil the water. So they talked about having to upgrade the cooling to the pool. So you've got pumps running the water to keep the water cool so it doesn't boil away, which would result in the rods melting and all kinds of nasty stuff. And that's kind of concerning because that pump stops working. And you can imagine the consequence. Of course, they've got backup pumps and generators and backup generators, but if the backup fails, that's obviously an issue. This is really concerning, and I'm still looking for a nuclear physicist who can explain it to me. It's so dense that what they're talking about is they have to store these spent fuel things in a checkerboard arrangement. You understand what I mean by that? They have to do that. And this is, again, an ESCOM report. And they can still meet the criterion for subcriticality. Anyway, any nuclear physicists, please come talk to me afterwards, because this seems to be saying that if you don't do that, the fuel will go critical. And fuel that goes critical is a runaway meltdown reaction. So it seems that we're rather worryingly close to that at Koeberg already. Okay, what's the time? How am I doing? Somebody. Economics. Let me talk about that. We're talking about spending R1 trillion. Oh, already? Oh, yeah. Okay. Just to talk briefly about economics. If we're talking about R1 trillion, I don't know if you can conceive what R1 trillion is. I can't conceive what it is. So I try to break it down a bit. And the RDP top structure, I found the Department of Human Settlements, strange name that it is, and they said it's 70,000 rand to build the top structure. I know from experience that about 100,000 rand you can cover your small home in photovoltaic cells and an off-grid system and have free electricity from the sun for life. For about solar water heaters, about 10,000 rand, maybe 15,000 rand, and 20,000 rand change, just in case some of the other figures were wrong. Let's say 200,000 rand for a house. If you put that into R1 trillion, you come up with 5 million houses. So if you put 4 people in each house, that's 20 million people could have a free house, could have free electricity for life, and free hot water for life for R1 trillion rand. So should we do that? What effect would it have on the social structure of the country? Or should we buy some technology from an overseas company and install nuclear power? In terms of costs, this is from the IRP, which is again a government document, and it shows the overnight construction costs of building various sources of power. And the interesting thing about this graph is how all the renewable sources are projected to get cheaper and cheaper. Government figures here, hey? So as the learning curve, it's called, as they produce more and more and the volumes increase, all the power sources are going to come down. Nuclear power, I think they're very optimistic. They say it's sort of basically flat. But what I think has happened, every time there's some kind of another disaster, because there inevitably will be more, they find more safety mechanisms they've got to put in. And so the cost gets higher and higher. The bed it sits on must get thicker. The exclusion zone must get bigger. The whatever. So I think that's very optimistic. But it's very clear what's going on here. Now, we can discuss this afterwards if we're interested, but this is the overnight costs and the peak power. So this wind you must maybe times by 4 to equalize it, and you get total levelized costs, which is a very complicated thing. But just to mention that briefly. The main thing to take from this is we now want to buy nuclear right now. Can you imagine how stupid it's going to look in 15 years when the plant is finished? That's how long it takes to build a nuclear plant. Okay, I'm going to have to go quickly. This is an interesting thing. You might have heard the word the nuclear renaissance, because countries are all on the point of ordering nuclear power, and I just want to rebut that nonsense. The nuclear industry is also fond of putting up a list of about 60 countries, and they say, these are the countries considering putting nuclear power in. Has anyone seen that kind of thing? Yeah? But now, isn't that a clever bit of PR spin? Because I'll put that same list up, and I'll say, these are 60 countries considering not putting nuclear power in. Because how can you consider doing something if you must be considering not doing it, right? That's the kind of clever PR spin that they come up with. Here are some facts. This is a list of nuclear reactors by age. So in other words, there are 3 reactors 2 years old, and there is one reactor 42 years old. Do you follow this graph? Now, what's strange about this is normally the youngest or most recent time on a graph is on the right, and the oldest time is on the left. So this is a bit of a counterintuitive graph. So let's switch it round so we can actually see it like we normally see stuff. So can you spot a bit of a trend there? Okay. That's what's happening to nuclear power around the world. And that's why the nuclear industry is becoming desperate. And that's why they're willing to do the lies that you've seen in the poster. And that's why they're mounting this concentrated public relations exercise to convince you of all kinds of garbage, like nuclear power is safe and clean and cheap, and wind turbines kill bats and birds, and solar power doesn't work, etc., etc. This is a little dig at ESCOM. Anyone from ESCOM here? Oh, what a waste. Okay. ESCOM defines baseload power as 70% of the time it's producing. And Koeberg, if you look at the two reactors, neither of them are baseload power. So you ever go to an ESCOM presentation, use that to give a little dig. They start to froth at the mouth, I notice. It's about 68% historically. Again, I'll go into more detail if people are interested in that afterwards. Climate change. A lot of people say that climate change is going to be addressed by nuclear power. And again, this is absolute nonsense. If we look at what we want to do to address climate change, well, we'd like to have something that's going to be soon, right? We know it's urgent, and they're saying that the COP, or cop-out as it's called, never seems to agree on quick enough targets. But to start building a whole lot of nuclear power stations, the first one's going to come online 10 to 15 years' time. During that time, you produce concrete, you drive trucks around, you do all sorts of stuff that generates carbon. So if we embarked upon an ambitious build to solve the world's problems by building nuclear power, we would destroy the planet before we managed to switch the first one on. We'd also like to not do something too expensive. You know, when you've got you're looking at mitigation measures, normally what you would try and do is do a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and all of them add up to go to a solution. But if you take all your money, like R1 trillion, and you do it in one solution and say that's the way we're going, it is a very dangerous situation. So you don't want to do that, because if something goes wrong, yeah, keep my language. You also want to minimize the building, cement. You want something that doesn't need ongoing mining. Because once you have a nuclear power plant, you still need to mine the uranium, process uranium, ship it to the processing plant, enrich it, make the fuel pellets. You know, all the uranium that's used in Koeberg is shipped off to Europe. It's then manufactured and shipped back. So this kind of nonsense that it's a zero carbon technology is, again, absolute nonsense. So I don't know if you can think of anything that satisfies this. What kind of power doesn't need us to mine and ship the fuel to it? You don't want to transport it. You want to create lots of jobs, you know, in this country particularly. You don't want to create some kind of nightmare in the future, whether it's 50 years, 200 years, 500 years, for future generations to have to deal with, like Fukushima. Preferably, you don't want to be able to create weapons of mass destruction from this, okay? Try throwing a wind turbine over the border. Preferably without opportunities for terrorists as well, you know, because they've identified that the biggest risk the world faces is a terrorist organization hijacking a nuclear fuel shipment and using that in what's called a dirty bomb. You pack some dynamite in it and you blow it all up, and it spreads out over a huge area. So, nuclear power is disqualified from addressing climate change because of this. So what alternatives are there? Because I often get this question. Once you start to crack people's faith in nuclear power, they say, but there's no alternative. We just got no choice, right? We just have to take these risks. So let's have a look. This is called the daily demand curve. And what happens is people wake up in the morning, they turn their kettle on or whatever, they go to work, and then they come home, and particularly in winter, that's the green one, people turn on their heaters and their stoves and all that kind of thing. So this is the cycle in a day. Now what ESCOM have done is they've built 40,000 megawatts to cater for this peak, and 40,000 megawatts of coal and a little bit of nuclear that run at full capacity all the time. So in other words, at this time of the day, there's a huge wastage of energy. Okay? And that's why they come up with these contracts, selling it at 12 cents a kilowatt hour to these foreign companies, which is less than they've actually produced it for, because at least they're getting something while these things are running all the time. Now, I was giving a talk the other day, and someone said, well, you'll never change anyone. How can you change everyone? How can you encourage people to turn their kettles on at different times? It's impossible, right? Can anyone think of a way of doing it? What's that? Flexi. Yeah, exactly. So it's so simple. All you say is, okay, guys, listen, between 6:30 and 7:30 in the evening, electricity is going to be twice as expensive. And tomorrow, everyone, not everyone, because some people say, I want my kettle boiled anyway, but what will happen is this will flatten the peak. Because a lot of people will say, you know what, we'll relax and have a drink and we'll cook later. And other people will say, I'm going to get home a bit early and do my cooking before the 6:30 crunch arrives. So what a simple thing to do to shift the peak. And can you imagine spending R1 trillion on looking at this kind of thing? Never mind energy efficiency, which we'll look at as well. And this is called demand-side management. Now, I like to sometimes tongue-in-cheek say that Woolworths has just appointed a new director whose job is to minimize the selling of vegetables. Does that make sense? Yeah, it's not going to be a very popular or successful department in Woolworths. But Eskom are trying it, and they are trying to make people buy less electricity through their so-called demand-side management. It's been a dismal failure. I think their solar water heaters, they achieved 1% of their target after a couple of years. Absolutely dismal. To be expected, Eskom is failing at this. This is a wind map of the world, and it's called a scattergram, and they take a satellite photo of the sea, and they look at how rough the sea is. You can see how much the light scatters. That's why it doesn't work on the land. And you can see immediately where the strong wind and the weak wind is. Equator, generally a very poor place for wind power, but the blue area is considered superb. It's highest in the world. And can you see the coast of South Africa? So there's a good indication that we have one of the best wind regimes in the world. Spain, not so good, but Spain manages to get a huge amount of its power from wind and from solar. Germany, same story. They're a bit more north, so they get better wind. You've also probably heard of the UK investing a lot in wind. South Africa, what percent of electricity does Eskom get from wind power? Any guesses? No cynics, please. There's a cynic speaking. Not null, it's 0.02%. Whereas a place like Germany gets about 20% from wind, despite the fact we've got the best wind in the world. That's a detailed map because there's been a lot of interest now, and the brown areas are areas that have high wind, about 9 meters a second average, and you can see the whole coast is ideal. But what's particularly interesting for this, for any engineers amongst you, is distribution is always a problem, rather transmission is a problem. When you generate power, you have to transmit it to Gauteng, to Cape Town, all right? But now if you look at this, then these little dots are substations, and this area here is perfect because you don't need to build any transmission lines. Not only do we have wind, we've got the wind in exactly the right place, but you get, let's say, 0% from it. Few quick slides. That's the trend of wind power. Don't think I have to explain to you across the world. South Africa is following this pattern. Also hear a lot of nonsense about wind. They take a lot of space. Who's heard that one? It kind of makes sense if you just hear it takes a lot. Yeah, I suppose so. Big things, they take a lot of space. Is that taking a lot of space? That's called multi-use. So the cows or whatever carry on grazing there. You've got a noisy highway. So even if the thing makes a bit of noise, no one cares. That truck was actually louder than that turbine. I took this photograph. Thank you. And I did a little calculation here because people often also talk nonsense about if you want to replace Koeberg, you're going to have to put wind turbines from here to Cairo and back or some such nonsense. There's a calculation. I'll sit down with any engineer and explain that. That's 100% true. In fact, it's a bit conservative because 25, it could be fewer than this. But I'm conservative. So 23 by 23, a square of turbines, and we could switch one of Koeberg's reactors off. It's not that impossible. I went to listen to it close up. I could hear the aircon unit inside, but I couldn't hear the wind turbine turning. It's true that some of the old turbines had a problem with the design of the blades, and they made a sound as they went round, but the modern turbines don't. It's also true that the very first set of turbines were built in a place in California, which was a migration path for raptors, and what happened is a lot of birds were killed. But since then, they've worked out EIAs, and they look where the migration paths are, and they build them where they don't have a lot of birds and bats. In fact, bats are more of a problem than birds. Very briefly, that's the sun map of the world. What should we do here? Okay, it's only Australia that's better. This is the country again. What do you notice? Exactly where the transmission lines are. Perfect place for a solar plant to be built. No need for any of these long transmission lines like they're talking about having to be built for the nuclear power stations, except for Koeberg. That's how a solar plant works, and I think I won't go into detail. Basically, it can store the heat overnight. So there's a place called Gemma Solar in Spain. That's the first solar plant that works 24 hours a day. They've had a few days in a row when it's generated power 24 hours a day. So that obviously is baseload power, and it can be used for that purpose. This is Belgium again, and these are privately installed tracking solar panels. And the government has a little tax incentive scheme, so farmers put this up because it's worth it for them. I think this cost 700,000 rand at the time, 70,000 euros, and it was tracking the sun. Now you can see it's a bit confused because this is Belgium, has the worst weather in the world. So what they're facing in different directions. And you can tell it's summer because it's a slightly lighter shade of grey. In winter it's darker. But despite that, they've actually built solar panels and they make it work. South Africa, best sun in the world, we do nothing to make this work. That's the trend. Again, it doesn't need much explanation. That's what's happening worldwide. South Africa is tracking along there. That's what they look like. I think that's Gemma Solar up there. And also you need a lot of people to clean those mirrors. You need a lot of people to put those mirrors up. It's fairly simple stuff. You put a whole lot of racks down and you bolt stuff to it. It's exactly the kind of job that we would find in South Africa, would be able to employ large quantities of people very quickly. Right, there we are, conclusions. Sure, before walkout gets too serious. It's dangerous, right? We know that there's all kinds of dangers from radioactivity, normal operations and from problems. It takes too long to build to be really taken seriously. 10, 15 years. Look up Olkiluoto in Finland sometime. They tend to have overruns. Olkiluoto was 11 months behind schedule after running for 11 months, the build. So they might as well have not started at that point. Incomplete plans, the missing toilet syndrome. They don't know what to do with the waste. And at the moment, it's just let it pile up at the power station. And if we're talking long term, we know anything you mine. I'm fond of saying it's something a beer drinker understands, which I can relate to. You have a glass that starts full and it gets emptier as time goes by. There's no escaping that, and there's no escaping that it gets empty at some point. When you mine stuff like uranium, however much there is, it gets less, right? So it's not a long-term solution. There's only one long-term solution, and that's use renewable energy. And that means one day we're going to have to do it. So why do we think about being so irresponsible as to not do it now? Why do we do this temporary thing that has 100,000 years of waste when we know it's not a long-term solution? So I think that's it. I'd like to stop there. And if anyone's patient enough to ask questions, then please feel free.